Absolutely. Hi, all. My name is Isa Drury. I am a immigration staff attorney at Make the Road, New Jersey, and my colleague, the supervising immigration attorney Ariel Gould, is also on the line.
Hi.
Yeah, um, and yeah, it's great to be back at this conference. It sounds like you guys have had some really meaningful sessions already, and that this is sort of woven into a broader set of exchanges. So, really looking forward to hearing from you all as well, a little bit more about what you're thinking and what you're seeing in your work and your lives. But today's session is about immigration enforcement and your rights with ICE. And we'll discuss that in a couple of different contexts. But to get started, oops, sorry, how am I going to click? There it is. Okay. Perfect. So Make the Road, New Jersey was founded in 2014, and we now have offices in Elizabeth, Perth Amboy, and Passaic. And we, Make the Road, New Jersey, is part of a coalition of chapters. We have sister organizations in New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Nevada. And we work to build the power of immigrant and working class communities of color to achieve dignity and respect. And that we work to do that through community organizing, legal and policy action, and transformative education. And so, um, you know, part of what that means is collaborating with our members and people from across New Jersey. And so it's really awesome to be here with all of you. Um, and so why we are here, I think, probably doesn't need a lot of introduction, but I do think that understanding where we are at and where you're at, more importantly, is helpful to sort of tailor our discussion today. So obviously, this administration is implementing policies, and you just heard from folks who are in Minneapolis. So I think there's no need to expound on that, but these policies are causing significant harm and fear in our communities. And we want to support you and empowering yourself and others to uphold the rights of people in New Jersey. And so I would love to quickly turn it over to the open floor and ask if anyone would be willing to share maybe what concerns they have in this moment in light of enhanced immigration enforcement and what particular context that might be coming up in your life, if it's in the context of school and work, on the street. If anyone feels like they want to share, please don't share anything that's confidential or that might disclose something that should be kept confidential. But if you could just maybe jump in even in the chat and just let me know a little bit more where you're at, we can then help tailor the conversation a little.
Yeah, thanks. So people can either do it in the chat or, you can unmute, you raise your hand and unmute if there's stuff that you want to share
Please.
directly. As people are thinking, and this sort of came up in the Minnesota section too, I've been thinking a lot about how to do mutual aid safely, right? Because of the increased enforcement, whether doing mutual aid can open the people that you're working with, make them more vulnerable. So that's something that I'm concerned with.
Nice. Yeah. And I think maybe we've given versions of this presentation in the past and also recently. And one thing that we've heard is that some organizations are coming up with policies or plans in particular for if there is ICE in their space. And that could be at a school, or it could be at a private business, or it could be on the street, or it could be for care providers. What happens if ICE shows up at the home where they're providing care? So these can be a myriad of contexts. So maybe that's another way to, if anyone has thoughts. Nice. Folks
Okay.
thinking a lot about TPS for
Yeah.
Haitian students. Absolutely, that came up. Cool. Well, if anyone thinks of something specific that they would like to know more about, feel free to jump in. But I will plug on with our presentation. The agenda, broadly speaking, is that we'll be discussing some immigration protection laws here in New Jersey that have been recently passed, and an overview of constitutional rights and rights in an encounter with immigration authorities or police. And then we'll hopefully have time at the end to talk a little bit. Well, actually, we will definitely have time at the end. This is very important, is how to think about practical preparation and practicing engaging with ICE. Sometimes that role playing, logically it makes sense, but having that role play opportunity can be really helpful to kind of see and feel what it might feel like. And, unfortunately, as a lawyer, it's obliged to include this disclaimers. But first of all, the presentation is not legal advice. And it is not, if you have a specific question about a specific case, it is important to contact someone directly and talk to them and seek some counsel. Cases are often much more complicated and small details can have significance. Also, during this presentation, what we discuss is not confidential. This is not a confidential space. So please refrain from bringing in information related to a specific case or disclosing something about an individual in this space. That would be better served in a one-on-one with an attorney who would be able to engage with that. And finally, this presentation does not provide policies designed for your specific workplace or your specific contexts. If you're in a work environment and you are asked to engage with ICE in that context, it might be a best practice to consult leaders at your organization to ask if there's any specific policies or guidelines in place, and or to collaborate with trusted community organizers or activists if you're thinking of engaging in other ways. These are best practices and an overview of your legal rights. And we sort of encourage you to think about best ways to employ them in your own contexts. Perfect. Great. I keep clicking on the scroll screen to see who's here instead of the next slide. So I'm getting to see all of your faces and names, which is nice, but not the next slide. Anyway, we'll jump into it. So the Immigrant Protections Package, has anyone heard of it? Here's a preview on the slide. Does anyone know what it is? Feel free to unmute, throw a reaction of yes if you've heard of this, or this is the very, if you've heard of it, let me know in some way. No. Okay, great. So the Immigrant Protections Package is a suite or a set of 3 bills. And they were passed this past winter, the first in January and then 2 others in March. But I certainly want to acknowledge that this came after years and years of advocacy and organizing and legislative sort of policy advocacy by many different organizations in New Jersey. And so very much, we keep us safe and we advocate for these bills, and we now see how they can be protecting us. But the first law, the Safe Communities Law, was signed in January 2026. And it establishes that, or it requires that the Attorney General's office create model policies on how essential public institutions should interact with ICE. And so you've heard me mention sort of like organization-specific policies, and I think a good example would be like, what is the receptionist at a hospital supposed to do when ICE shows up? And instructing and guiding and empowering that individual to know what the sort of basic legal framework is around that interaction is really important. And the Safe Communities Act sort of creates a framework in which those individuals who might be encountering ICE at those locations know what their rights are and what the duties of ICE are, even more importantly, perhaps. And there has been a system put in place to have some engagement from community to help draft and put forward those best practices. The next, the set of locations are sort of what you might imagine an essential public institution would be. Healthcare facilities, as an example, schools, shelters, courts, very importantly, funeral homes, food banks, etc. And so maybe folks on this line will have heard of the Biden era policy where there were so-called sensitive locations, and ICE was encouraged not to engage in enforcement action there or to deprioritize enforcement action at those places. And Trump has terminated that policy. And so, this isn't necessarily like a creation of a state version of that. It's simply just clarifying what duties ICE has to access those. regardless. And the next law that was signed into, the next bill that was signed into law is the Privacy Protection Act. And this act allows sites, or it requires that state agencies collect only what they need to administer their job, and to not collect unnecessary or additional information. And this was responsive in part to a inadvertent disclosure, an inadvertent disclosure by the Motor Vehicle Commission, of data they were collecting to ICE, and that was happening through the automated license plate readers. And so I see a question in the chat about the prior bill, so I'll just pop back really quickly to talk about that. The bill says schools. I think an adult school is probably a school. I think we can talk a little bit more about this specifically in terms of what are your rights in certain contexts, but one of them is in a private context, right? And there are parts of an organization that might be open to the public. And so if there was an adult school that had a public lobby, for example, ICE can come into the public lobby. But if there was a receptionist there that said, hello, do you have an appointment? The way that we can talk more specifically about this, but ICE needs to have a judicially signed warrant in order to come into the private areas of any location, a private business especially, but also that applies to these areas as well. And so I think when the model policies come out, there will probably be model policies that apply to public schools, and it would then be useful probably to look at model policies and consider the layout, the structure, the organization of an adult school, and see how that policy might map onto that organization. So I think that's kind of a soft yes, but would be interesting to see what the model policy said, if that answers your question. And for the Privacy Act, important to note that there's no affirmative indication that state agencies were actively sharing data with ICE. There's a lot of fear in the community. We don't need to build that. But so confirming that this was not responsive to sort of an active sharing, but rather an inadvertent sharing through automated license plate readers. And the Privacy Protection Act was designed to close that loop. And part of what they do is part of what comes from this is also the creation of a private cause of action. Individuals can seek damages, money, if someone discloses their private information without their consent. And that's just a way to try and help enforce that as well. And the next law, which is actually the first one that was codified and the oldest sort of in the ecosystem of New Jersey policy, is the codification of the Immigrant Trust Directive. And so the Immigrant Trust Directive has been around since 2018. And it was initially sort of a policy, sort of a directive from the governor, and now has been codified into law. And it specifically limits, I'm going to pull up my notes actually, because there's some interesting language in it specifically. So it limits the assistance that local law enforcement can give to federal immigration enforcement. And the key detail here is that it doesn't prohibit engagement when that's necessary, but it pursuant to a few exceptions, it states that no state, county, or local law enforcement agency shall provide a list of types of assistance, which includes participating in immigration enforcement operations, providing non-public personal information, and providing access to any state, county, or local law enforcement equipment, office, database, or property not available to the general public. So you see this kind of coming up again and again. Really what this theme is that ICE has duties, and if they want to go beyond what is available to the general public, they need to get a judicial warrant. And these are just different ways of making sure that ICE is meeting that standard. And there are certain exceptions, but another way in which the Immigrant Trust Directive sort of ensures that local law enforcement are using local law enforcement resources for their own sort of mission and purpose is that aside from a few specific exceptions, individuals who are detained local law enforcement does not have an obligation to notify ICE when they're being released if they're non-citizens. And there are a few exceptions to that rule, including where individuals have committed certain types of crimes or charged, committed certain types of crimes. But the Immigrant Trust Directive is now law, and it's been challenged 3 times in its prior form as a directive and survived each one of them. And so sometimes there's discussion in the media and the news around what can states do to actually stand up to ICE as a federal agency. And one of the things that has been successful and demonstrably so is this kind of requirement or this kind of clarification of the role of local state law enforcement. And that's a lot, but I think we see law enforcement being deputized by ICE, and we see law enforcement sort of collaborating with them, alerting them to certain actions, and this really makes it much, much harder, and means that ICE can't then just come in and use local law enforcement resources for immigration purposes in a way that they should not be. That is the last of the bills. And so these sort of set up the context in which to talk about our sort of constitutional rights when interacting with ICE. And you'll see there's a little bit of a theme where these bills are really trying to clarify and confirm how these constitutional rights like operate in practice, right? Like we have this idea, you have a right to remain silent, but how and where does that get used in practice? Okay. Speaking of a right to remain silent, there are some constitutional rights that apply to everyone, regardless of their immigration status. And there are rights in the United States. Not every single person here had the exact same rights, but these rights apply to everyone. And that is the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, not to be assigned and given an attorney for free in immigration, but the right to an attorney, to have counsel, and the right to refuse a warrantless arrest. And we're going to talk a lot about the third one, and we'll talk a little bit more about the second one in practice. Great. But before I guess we dig too much more into this, I'll just pause for 1 second. Any questions? Anything to jump in about for the bills? Okay. Great.
Sorry, I will add one thing, which is that in addition to the state, there's municipalities that are also working on versions of that. And depending upon the municipality, it'll either be a stronger or a weaker version of that state law.
Totally. I think Jersey City has a great one. But that's a great point. Thanks, Eric. Awesome. So again, as you've heard, you just heard from folks who are working and organizing and engaging in Minnesota. So no need to explain to you necessarily that ICE uses tactics to circumvent their legal obligations. And sometimes this is very explicit, and sometimes it's a little bit more subtle. ICE does currently have the right, and they can detain people who violate the terms of their visas or other sort of immigration laws. And they can detain people when they go to appointments if they have reason to believe they violated those immigration laws. But they do not have the right to arrest someone without due process of law, without that reason to believe they have violated an immigration law. And they cannot enter the home or a private place without a signed judicial warrant. And so a lot of what we're about to talk about is just confirming when ICE needs to adhere to these minimum standards. And we see ICE being, nefarious in trying to evade them, these tactics being used by different agents to try and get into homes, saying they're searching for a fugitive, or saying that someone's ankle monitor is broken and they need to come out to fix it and detaining someone, or a lot of reports of collateral arrests where their ICE agents are sort of looking for one person and they can't find them and they arrest someone else. And these are not compliant with the Constitution. They're not. And so we are collectively empowered to hold ICE to that minimum standard. I did it again. Moving through the screen on Zoom and not the slides. Great. So how do we push back on these tactics by ICE? We know our rights. Rights in public, rights while we're driving, rights in our home, rights at work, and rights at school. And for the purposes of this, school will include adult school. Although I hear you, there's maybe a difference between a public state-funded school and an adult school, nonprofit or privately funded. So we can talk about that. Great. So I think obviously there is, ICE doesn't always identify themselves. And that is sort of can be very problematic. But sometimes ICE can be identified by the uniforms that they're wearing. It will say something like police ICE on their uniforms, Department of Homeland Security or Homeland Security Investigation. And this is the Department of Homeland Security's logo. Blow it up, hopefully big enough for you to see. And this is not law enforcement. And I think it's really important to be able to visually distinguish between ICE and law enforcement, especially in states where law enforcement cannot be deputized by ICE in quite the same way. And it means that, pending a few exceptions, local law enforcement should not be asking about immigration status unless it's essential for a criminal investigation, right? And so here are a couple of other examples of ICE uniforms. They also have the Custom and Border Patrol operation agents who engage with ICE as well. And then here you can see police. Sorry, this one actually, Homeland Security Investigation. This top one is also ICE, and this bottom one is police. And so sort of keeping an eye out for the differences there. And also remembering that ICE can be dressed as a civilian and not in uniform. And so what we're going to talk about now is what to do when you see ICE or when you're encountering ICE. Broadly speaking, best practices generally are to stay calm and to assert your rights and to take notes or document what's going on. And we can talk a little bit more about that. There's some folks who feel very understandably uncomfortable about that or unsure if that's permitted based on the role that they're holding. And so that's maybe something to think a little bit more about, depending on what your positionality is and what your role is in that moment. But generally, you are an observer, and that, you are permitted to observe and to record insofar as you're taking notes or sort of as an eyewitness, recording what happens after, etc. Don't lie, run, use false documents, resist arrest, or help someone resisting arrest, or sign anything without consulting a lawyer, or answer the agent's questions. And I know that's first and I said it last because we can talk a little bit more about that. You do have the right to remain silent, and you don't have to answer the agent's questions. And we can practice that a little because that can be really hard to do in practice. And we have a couple of strategies to offer to how to sort of build up the muscle of not answering an agent's questions. And before we jump in, well, we're going to now go through sort of the specifics for a few different contexts and what your rights are in those contexts. But before I do that, I'm just going to take another pause to see if anyone has thoughts or if they want to jump in and talk about an instance, maybe if any of these specific places are relevant. Please feel free to jump in and say, I really want to talk about this. I know of people in my life, in my community, who are facing contacts with ICE in these contexts, and we can spend a little bit more time on them. Otherwise, we're going to move kind of quickly because I want to get to the how do you individually prepare, in anticipation for potential enforcement, and then we can practice a little. So, as we stated, ICE can only arrest you if they have probable cause that you were here without legal status or that you meet the requirements for deportation. And you have the right to remain silent and not to answer any questions that could give them probable cause to believe that you are being detained. I hear there's responses in the chat, but I am not seeing them.
I don't see any particular ones. There was just the question about adult schools. I didn't see any
Oh,
other
okay,
ones.
perfect. Okay, and um, this includes sharing your nationality and sharing your immigration status. And one of the really important ways to not provide that information is thinking about what documents you have. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But one of the reasons why it's important to think about, not carrying a foreign passport with you, for example, or some of these other details is for this reason, because you don't have to give them probable cause and you don't have to sort of share information about your nationality with them. Um, and the sort of like legal framework that governs these rights is that the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution protects you from self-incrimination. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches and seizures. And a last sort of best practice is don't run, because if you do, that can be considered a probable cause or a good reason for ICE to detain you. It makes them believe that you are in violation of a law, that you feel guilty in some way. And so we can run through this and we will role play a little. But one of the things you can do to protect yourself is to engage with the officer initially and say, am I free to go? And if they say yes, you can say, I'm choosing to leave and I don't want to answer any questions. And that can be a really helpful sort of line to come back to. Like, I don't want to answer any questions. I don't want to speak without a lawyer. I don't want to talk to you. Just like, I'm not trying to make, de-escalating the situation potentially, and confirming and coming back to this idea that you have no obligation to answer their questions and you're not going to. Am I free to go? I don't want to answer your questions. And to remain calm and sort of come back to that. And if they say you are not free to go, you can ask if you are under arrest. And if they say no again, you come back to, like, I am not answering your questions. I will not be speaking to you. And so if I'm not under arrest, I'm not going to be speaking to you. We're a bit at an impasse here, and sort of slowly leave. If they say yes, again, you can still say silent. I don't want to answer your questions. I would like to speak to an attorney. And we did some role plays at a recent sort of workshop. And some of these things seem really clear on paper, but in practice, it's much more difficult. And I've seen an ICE arrest, and it's chaotic, it's stressful. And so part of what is helpful in these presentations and thinking about this is not so much understanding the theory, but really feeling confident that you can rely on that information in practice. Okay, so while you're driving, there's many different contexts, obviously, that you could interact with ICE, and they have slightly different rights in each one. So in New Jersey, you have to be a licensed driver, but you do not need to be a citizen to have a New Jersey's driver's license. You do need to have a driver's license, vehicle registration, and your insurance. And if you're stopped while you're driving, the very best practice is to show your state issued New Jersey driver's license or another US issued driver's document. Don't show foreign or false identification. Because if you show a New Jersey driver's license, there's no probable cause there's no reason at all that ICE should arrest you. If you had a traffic infraction, the police might give you a ticket, but ICE has no reason, that has nothing to do with immigration, right? Nothing at all. Additionally, ICE cannot search a car unless they have a warrant signed by a judge. Now, cars are a little different than houses. It's a little tiny bit easier to get exceptions to that. But in general, ICE cannot search a car unless they have a warrant signed by a judge. And it's very much acceptable to say, I do not consent to this search. I need to see a judicially signed warrant before you can come into this car. And this is a good sort of segue into our rights in the home, which are, even clearer, if you will, because the sanctity of the home is sort of it's like a very basic cornerstone of constitutional of privacy law and constitutional law. Like you cannot enter a home without a judicial warrant that is signed by a judge. And in order for ICE to legally enter your home, you have to invite them inside if they don't have a warrant. And so you can and should not open your door if there are law enforcement outside. And you can ask them to provide the warrant under the door. And there's some resources, and we can drop them in the chat, or I'll send them to Eric after. There's some sort of best practices where they're designed to be on the back of the door. You can print them out in whatever language of choice. I think there's 4 or 5 options, and have them on the back of your door so that in a moment when there's law enforcement officers on the other side, you have the reminder on the back of your door that says, do not open. Show me your warrant, like under the door. I will not be opening. And we'll review in a moment what those judicial warrants look like. But also, we've seen tactics where ICE pretends to be a police officer to gain access to homes, but police also need a warrant to enter a home. So this kind of through line is very helpful because it is sort of a generally applicable requirement. Like you need a reason to come into my home. My home is my private space. The state cannot access it without reaching this threshold of procedure. And that's very basic sort of foundational law in the US. Some of this is repetitive. I think at last time I gave this presentation, I said judicial warrant around 150 times. But sometimes that's helpful. That's sort of affirming to know sort of what your rights are in those moments. But don't open the door and ask to see that warrant, and then look at the warrant and see if it's valid. And so the next slide is a sample of what a judicial warrant looks like. And I don't know, some of you might be on phones or on smaller sort of screens, and you might not be able to see the details, but I would suggest maybe taking a look at this slide more carefully when you do have a moment, because there's a big difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant here, and you can sort of see that. But most critically, nice. Eric will share a curriculum document that has samples of both. Eric, perfect. A judicial warrant is signed by a judge, and it has, behind a judicial warrant is the idea that this person that signs it is a neutral arbitrator, or neutral arbiter, and they're going to look at why the state needs this warrant, like what the probable cause is to give them this warrant. And it is signed by a judge, which is what indicates that that process has been satisfied. Whereas here, it is signed by an immigration officer and not a judge. And this is not sufficient to enter a home. And it is not sufficient to enter the private places in a building, like a school or a business, etc. And so a lot of what these new laws are encouraging is for society and for individuals who could interact with ICE to really know what these standards are and to hold ICE to them. Oh no, some duplication here on the slide. Sorry about that. And the same applies. Let's just make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. So the same applies in the rights at work. ICE can enter the public areas of a business without special permission if the public has the right to enter. So if you're thinking about a shop or a store, for example, there are parts of that are just open to the public during open hours, and ICE can enter without a warrant at that time. But they cannot enter the private parts of the store, for example, the employee's back area or the stocking room or a break room, for example. And these can be delineated with signs. I've started noticing around New Jersey and around New York, restaurants often have signs on their doors that delineate the private areas from the public areas. And we have those on our office doors that say, this is a private space. It is not open to the public. You cannot come in unless we consent for you to come in or you have a judicial warrant. And that can be a really helpful way to sort of confirm in the moment that if ICE is coming in without that warrant and without your consent, that they are doing so illegally. And obviously the goal would be to not have them come in at all. But if they do come in and then arrest someone, that is an illegal arrest. And then it is possible to challenge that in court. And there's been a lot of success seen in challenging ICE's illegal arrests. And so what part of what this is doing is creating the circumstances and the context in which that those kinds of subsequent actions, if necessary, can be more successful. And yes, clear signage, super, super important. And I think just bringing this back to this question of like adult schools, what is the role and what is the sort of space? I think definitely checking the model policies when the AG publishes them. The deadline was 180 days after the law was passed, which is in the end of March. So they're sort of forthcoming, or maybe seeking to see what other best practices other schools are using. But in the context of a private space that is not a public school, these rules can still apply if the school is an adult school, that it falls outside the ambit of a public sort of public school, public facility. And speaking a little bit more specifically about public schools, and here the idea is, in fact, repeat which. Speaking about public areas versus private areas at work, the Attorney General is publishing under the Safe Communities Act best practices for essential public institutions, including schools, and those will be forthcoming. And those types of policies set forth what school staff should do when ICE comes to school. So, for example, security officers at the front or receptionists who are welcoming people to the school. There may be parts of the public school that are truly open to the public, but much of the public school is not actually open to the public. And so the Attorney General will be publishing guidelines that say what schools, public schools, should do if ICE comes. And that often, I've seen a couple sort of sample preliminary types of policies, and that often means that receptionists or staff should ask for a judicial warrant. And not every staff member needs to be able to determine a judicial warrant from an administrative warrant, but needs to know that there's a little bit more that needs to happen before they can just come in. ICE officers can just come in. And so in the context of an adult school, it would be a kind of a case-by-case analysis to understand, is this a public adult school or is this private? Is this a nonprofit? I think the analogy of what do you do in the workplace can be helpful in thinking about if the adult school is a community center and it's open to the public, ICE potentially can come into the part of the space that's open to the public during the open hours. But if it is a closed space and it is a private space, ICE would need a judicial warrant to come in. And so this is just thinking about if an adult school sort of sits between what is a perfect analogy to a public school where there'll be clear guidelines coming forth, and a private institution or business, thinking about how to map on there. And I see, Eric, you came on video. Is there something you wanted to say?
Yeah, so Jen, you had a question. Jen, you wanted them to repeat something. What did you want them to repeat or clarify?
No, I was just asking her to repeat the last part, but she did. She just repeated it. Thank you.
Yeah, did that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Perfect. Cool. Great. Let's see. So this is a little bit more targeted to public schools. Yeah. Christian?
Yes, I maybe able to shed some light as to what happens with adult school. When all of this started, we received a communication from the Department of Labor that established the rules that schools were using. And literally, we were told to not allow anybody in until the person at the higher level could review that order and do what needed to be done.
Awesome.
Of course, that I'm sure has changed, but we haven't received anything else yet.
Yeah. No, I mean, that sounds really aligned with some of the preliminary guidance that public schools have gotten to sort of invite federal immigration law enforcement to, if they don't have a warrant, to sort of say they're not allowed to come in. And if they're there and they have a warrant and they present a document, to sort of invite them to wait and send that document up to supervisors and then potentially to council. And in the context of public schools, schools obviously have a duty to notify parents when minors are being sort of, there's questions about minors or they're being sought to have an interview or speak to law enforcement. And so part of what that is responding to, that sort of process is responding to, is to give time to notify parents so that they can be present and be aware, and ultimately say no if there's no judicial warrant, right? But it sounds like that's very similar type of process as what is sort of emerging at public schools as well. And yeah, I think, it really just comes down to, you have a right to deny entry if they don't have a warrant. And obviously, you probably have seen in the media that ICE can be very violent, right? And someone in a prior KYR, a Know Your Rights presentation, had mentioned that, what are you supposed to do if they are proceeding without a warrant, right? Like, that I think can be a case-by-case analysis, and we're not necessarily suggesting, or we don't have the capacity to give guidance on each instance. These are sort of the best practices, and it's really important to have a plan among the people you spend your days with of what to do in that situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about what does happen if someone does get detained, and then how to prepare for it, which I think is important. And keeping an eye on the time, I'm going to keep moving. Right. So this, I think, is probably better to just have Eric send around. But it's mostly just important to know that there is some state funding to help represent people who are being detained. And these are some of the resources that, that exist. And you can call these numbers and hope to get them connected to legal representation. But I think the best way to access that is to have this information in front of you and do a little research, look them up, Google them, etc. Okay, so this, I think, is very important, and I know we only have 15 minutes left, so I'm going to just jump right in. What can organizations and people who are providing services do right now to be more prepared for possible immigration enforcement? So we mentioned that you need to have probable cause to arrest someone. And so one thing, well, actually, we'll talk about that in a second. You can organize your documents in advance. And it can be very painful. And I actually don't, it's hard for me to be like, here's how you can prepare literally to be detained, when that detention could be illegal, right? Like, that's a tension, sort of psychologically, to be like, I'm preparing my documents to have this worst case scenario happen, but it can be very, very helpful and make both your legal defense easier and your sort of family unit's life easier. And so having your documents, knowing where your important documents are, sort of your personal documents, your immigration documents, identity documents, school records, if you're, if you have a kid, or if you have your own school records, your birth certificate, medical records, things that, you have in your home, having them in one place and organized and, safe place. And maybe letting trusted family members or friends know where they are, can be helpful. And this can include criminal cases, and also documents that relate to how long you've been in the US. And I'm not going to get into all of the specifics, but there are certain types of immigration benefits that require proof of the disposition of a criminal case, for example, or also proof for how long you've been in the US. And so some of these types of documents have very specific purposes and can be very hard to get if you have been detained. And so having all of these relevant documents in one place can be super helpful to build up a legal defense if you are detained. In particular, in criminal cases, if you have, if the case was dismissed, but there was some record of it, having that dismissal can be vital to have a better chance at proceeding in your immigration case. And similarly, confirming, proof of residence, sort of how long you've been in the US can make you eligible and make your case stronger depending on your positionality. Other ways to be ready are to make a list of an emergency contacts, trusted family members, friends, community members, and leave that with someone so that if you yourself are detained, that is there. Or if maybe being the person that receives those, right? Like if you feel that you are personally at a lower risk of detention, and you work with colleagues, friends, family who have a higher risk, being the person that's holding on to some of that information, and being that trusted family member or friend, to know who to call, like my kid's kindergarten teacher, so that they don't think that she's absent, she's just staying with an aunt out of state. Sort of these little details that you might not be thinking about, and that can be really painful to think about, and can be really scary, and yeah, anxiety inducing, but can be so important. And so finding the right time to think about these things when you know you're feeling safe and well and able can be really important. And talking to a lawyer about risks that might be specific to you, and talking to a lawyer to be like, this is my broad situation, like which documents are really important, what should I have kind of in my packet, to have available, and what things should I be thinking about, or what options can I take to minimize risk. And that's, important because sometimes little details matter a lot in an immigration case. And sometimes that might not be so obvious, even based on careful reading of resources online. And so having someone else to even just look at something with a second set of eyes can be really helpful. And there's also a lot of misinformation online right now, and that makes sense. There's a lot of fear, and there's so much changing, that something that could have been true 3 months ago is no longer true. And that's not because this person has any bad will, they just haven't updated their resource. And so getting contemporaneous information is really helpful, and sort of confirming things as you're making your plan. And then finally, making a plan for your family, thinking about care for children or elderly. We'll talk a little bit more about a couple of very specific strategies on that. And thinking about medical care, again, having documentation of diagnoses or prescriptions, thinking about, preparing for like being unavailable from your home for a period of time. What would you do in that case? Thinking about a financial plan, rendering, making a plan for how you might access your resources if you are no longer in the country, or if you're dependent on someone, how you might access their resources if they're detained. And then preparing travel documents for children. And so thinking about, who is eligible for a passport, and maybe we should get them a passport, and who, what documents do the children have, and can we get them a document, be it from the US or from some other place? Can we get them a New Jersey driver's license, or an ID? Kind of putting together some basic information that can be, quickly accessed and readily available. And in particular, in the context of children, one really important thing that can be done is drafting a power of attorney, to delegate who has the temporary legal authority to provide care and make decisions on behalf of your children. And so the New Jersey Consortium on Immigrant Children has, and I copied this link, but now I can't access it. That's too bad. Has a really helpful set of resources, about providing and preparing a power of attorney that's applicable for people that live in New Jersey. There was a question earlier in a different context about what happens when someone who is a potential caregiver lives outside in a different state. And we know that this power of attorney is actually derived explicitly from New Jersey law, and it applies in New Jersey. And so anyone with sort of a cross-state situation probably is best served by speaking to a family law attorney in the other state to understand a little bit more about the provisions there. But preparing a power of attorney, which also has the form that I will put in the chat in a minute, has information about best practices for child planning. So like naming the list of the schools that they go to, and their education information, and anything that is important to know about the child's care in terms of like medical history or dietary concerns or allergies and things like that. And so it's really hard, I think, to think about some of these tiny details when the threat of ICE is so present. And so part of this can also just be sort of distilling down some of the little details that can make things a little easier for loved ones. And sometimes that process itself can be cathartic, feeling that you're prepared a bit more. Ariel, I don't know actually if you could drop the NJCIC resources links in, that would be great. I have them in my notes, but they are
Yes, I can.
not. Thank you. So unfortunately, I think we only have 8 minutes left, but we're going to try and use it to the best we can. So for documents, we mentioned you need probable cause. ICE needs probable cause to arrest you. Probable cause that you violated an immigration law, right? So if you give them a document that is fake, that's kind of indicative that that's fraudulent, and also potentially indicative that you don't have another document, and that as a result, you might have reason to believe you're in violation of a law. Also, if you give a foreign passport, also potentially probable cause to indicate that you are not a US citizen, or why is it that you're not giving a US document, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that if you give a foreign passport that confirms you're here without, that you're in violation of the law. But because of this enforcement moment that we're in, best practice is that you should carry other documents if you can. And that includes a green card if you have it, and definitely a state driver's license if you have it. A really, really, really good thing to get a New Jersey driver's license if you have it. Municipal ID, although I have heard in some contexts that municipal IDs are not, USCIS has not accepted municipal ID. It's unclear if ICE would or not, but that can still be something that shows your identification at the very least. And a red KYR card, which we're going to talk about in 1 second, which just sort of states your rights. And in the moment of pressure, when you're engaging with an ICE officer, that can be a really helpful way to remind yourself what your most basic rights are and what your sort of plan should be. And if you do not have valid immigration documents, it's best to tell the officer you want to remain silent. And there are specific policies that can make it easier for ICE to detain someone and keep them in detention. And so keeping documentation on you that shows maybe that you've been here for a longer period of time can also be helpful. And again, if you have specific questions, I think best to consult with an attorney about that. And then the last note is if you have red cards, and I don't know, Eric, if you've come across these, but this is a digital format, so we can't give you some, but a lot of different red cards exist. But the basic overview is what we've been talking about, right? Like, you do not have permission to enter my home. I do not give you consent to a search. I do not want to speak with you without my attorney. And if you're, in a moment of stress or panic, maybe folks on this call have seen ICE arrests. Maybe folks on this call are part of rapid response, and you're building up those muscles, so you're responding in a calm way. But when I saw my first ICE arrest, it was very stressful, right? And like, your adrenaline is pumping and things are moving quickly. And so sometimes just having a card that summarizes what you want, your rights, and handing it to them can be very, very helpful. Okay. A few things to note that you should not do without significant sort of thinking and engagement with a lawyer to sort of understand the consequences. You should not conceal a person for whom ICE is searching, assist someone from escaping ICE, or instructing a person not to answer questions, which is different from saying you have the right to remain silent. And I know that seems subtle, but that's kind of an important sort of distinction. And remember that you are entirely within your rights not to answer questions from ICE, and not to allow ICE into a place that is non-public without a judicial warrant. Here I go again on the judicial warrants. Oops. Great. And this we can talk about in the slides after, but I'm going to move here. So we have only 4 minutes left. But in those 4 minutes, I would want to ask if anyone has any interest in role playing. I'm happy to play. Well, I'm not happy, but I'm willing to play the ICE officer. If anyone wants to practice a little bit what it might feel like if, someone showed up at an adult school and tried to enter. If anyone would volunteer to, if multiple people want to volunteer, that's great too. But if anyone wants to volunteer to do a quick role play before we wrap up. Or if we
All
only
right,
have,
I'll go if nobody else wants to volunteer. I'll go. It's fine.
okay, do you want to be the instructor, the teacher, or do you want to be the ICE agent?
I'm a old white guy. I think I'm a little bit typecast, so I'll go with the ICE agent.
Okay.
I gotta talk to my agent about this, that I'm getting pigeonholed in these roles, but I'm willing to take one for the team here. So
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm I'm sort of sitting behind a desk at a place that has a small reception office. Go
okay.
ahead.
So I have some questions about some folks that are here.
Sorry, who are you?
Oh yeah, I'm with ICE, but I have some questions about some people here. I think you have a number of people here who are illegal.
Do you have any documentation?
Yeah, here's our warrant. You can see, and then
So, unfortunately, I'm not able to answer any questions or speak to you any further. Without a judicially signed warrant, you can't enter this place.
yeah, I know I don't have the judicial warrant, but just like I think it would go better for everybody if you would just like let's talk. Let's just like we can just have a conversation.
I'm sorry, but I can't speak to you. I'm not interested in talking to you.
That's rude.
Right. I think it kind of it contradicts some of our, like learned community interaction, right? Like saying no repeatedly.
Yes.
And it can feel very jarring to say that and say it over and over and over again. And also I think, notwithstanding the typecast, they might still be a little bit harsher than that.
Yeah, sorry.
Like give me your identification or otherwise.
Yes.
But thank you so much, Eric. And I genuinely, I know this might sound silly, but I would encourage, if you're in a context with a colleague and you're in person, like just take 5 minutes and like role play it. See what it feels like. It feels weird the first time you do it, and so I would encourage you to take that time to do so.
So right now I'm dropping the link for the PD certificate in the chat. And then this is also, I'm going to drop the link in for a curriculum that I designed with students that make their own New Jersey about this very thing. And I'm going to share my screen. And
I should stop sharing.
This is what you'll see. Yeah, sorry. All right, so this is what you'll see in the document. We have a variety of these dialogues, right? These scenarios. Can everybody see the dialogue? Right. So like, this person's a little bit more rude, is that right? You come over here. Why? I want to speak with you. Am I free to leave? Yes, but I want to speak with you. I'm free to leave. I'm going to leave. Right. And so then we have scenarios with like people on the street, or if they come to your house or apartment, right? And then various things, right? So do you have a warrant? Slide it under the door, all these types of things, right? Or, I also have like, if ICE has the wrong address, right? Like don't give them the right address, right? Or if ICE has a warrant and it's a judicial warrant, but they got the wrong person, you're like, sorry, not my job. Not going to help you, right? Again, don't lie, right? You can't lie, but you're like, I'm not that person. Do you know where that person is? I'm not that person, right? So the link, if you'll see, that's available there. I'll stop sharing there.
Awesome. Eric, we might need to talk about whether or not we can like borrow that. That looks amazing. And
I distributed it to, when I made it, I distributed it to all the
oh, cool.
folks. And then this is a third. This goes to my website, which has a bunch of resources. And one of them, there's a link for Know Your Rights resources. and it has a collection of red cards. So red cards in a variety of languages and red cards in a variety of formats. So that those resources are there.
Oh, Eric, this is great. Perfect. Well, I'm sorry for going a little bit over. I know you guys have a really packed agenda, but it seems like you're in great hands and Eric has a lot of these resources already and that you're having really, yeah, generative exchange in these few days. So thanks for letting us be a part of it. And if things do come up or if there's follow-up questions, like please let us know. Yeah, we're available and longtime partner collaborator with NJ for All.